This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, with a discussion on more tax and legal issues involving partnerships, estate planning, and Social Security. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, keeps the show rolling with information on how much longer people will likely be seeing armyworms and fall armyworms in their fields. The Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster close out the show with a segment from their Cattle Chat podcast. This week, they discuss imports, exports, and consumption of beef around the world. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show discussing more legal and tax issues with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us once again.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, you recently wrote a blog article covering some more issues that sometimes people in agriculture can be facing. And so as we talk through a few of these different topics, first one involving partnerships and how partnerships are formed.
Yeah, farmers and ranchers often do business informally on a number of things, and that includes business relationships. It might be with a tenant, it might be you hire someone to work with you, it might be a family member that's working with you. Well, it's that informality. In many instances, these relationships to writing, so we don't really know from a legal standpoint what type of relationship it is, but it's that informality that raises the question of whether that business arrangement has created a partnership. Well, if something happens, say a liability event, and it's determined that you're in a partnership, well, then you've got numerous legal issues, and you may also have tax issues, too.
If partnerships are informal, is it worth going in and making them formal?
Often it is, because of this potential of unlimited liability. Partners are jointly and severally liable for the debts of the partnership that arise out of partnership business. And a partnership has a special way that it files its taxes. It does it on a Form 1065, and then you have distributions that may be attributable to the individual partners. You might have guaranteed payments or salary, those types of things. And the assets that are deemed to be partnership assets could pass differently upon the death of someone that's deemed to be a partner. So, for example, if I'm in farming or ranching operations, say, with a sibling of mine, and I die and are deemed to have been in a partnership, then where does my partnership interest go? Well, it may end up, if we're just jointly owning everything, it may end up in my sibling's hands. And so now my sibling is dealing with perhaps my spouse, because my spouse may get my interest, my sibling might get my interest. There's a lot of uncertainty with respect to that, and it can really hamper the future of the business from generation to generation. So we need formality in that respect to make sure that if we want to transition the business, that these informal arrangements don't cause problems.
And as we're thinking about arrangements, a lot of times in leases, it's not a partnership, but maybe worth putting into that lease agreement.
Exactly. If I've got a tenant, often I don't want to be in a partnership with my tenant, whether it's a crop lease, a livestock lease, even an oil and gas lease. But often in the oil and gas situations or in mineral situations, we do have the agreement in writing because we're dealing with a company in that situation. So most of the time, what I'm talking about here would be crop or livestock situations. And we want to have a written lease that clearly specifies that in those situations is this lease to be construed as a partnership. Because, again, I don't want to be in a liability situation where I'm jointly and severally liable for something my tenant has done. So we just want to, again, put things in writing to clearly specify what our intent is with respect to relationships that we get into.
And something else really important to get in writing and do some thinking on estate planning. And what are some common mistakes you see in estate planning?
Well, like we said, the informal business relationship can be a mistake from an estate planning standpoint. But more specifically, I'd say the things that I would see is people are not careful in making sure that the way they own title to their real estate in particular complies with their overall estate planning goals and objectives. And so that would include the proper use of jointly held property, as well as IRAs, as well as any other document that has a beneficiary designation on it. We want to make sure that beneficiary designation or who would be the surviving owner on jointly held property comports with my overall estate plan. Does it move the property in the way I want it to go once I'm gone? And so that's a key point, making sure that title ownership lines up with your overall goals and objectives of your estate plan. That's a big one that's out there.
And something else possibly important for the next generation, federal state tax?
Well, that certainly can be an issue. Now, the federal estate tax doesn't apply to hardly any farms or ranches at all. The data indicate it's less than 1%. But that's because the current exemption is so high for the vast majority of farmers. It's at $13.61 million per person right now. So for a married couple, that's over $27 million that is protected from federal estate tax. And Kansas doesn't have a state-level estate tax or a state inheritance tax. That was repealed a couple of decades ago. But the concern that's on many people's minds is if the current law is allowed to sunset at the end of 2025, then that exemption would go from what we anticipate will be about $14.3 million per person next year down to about half of that starting in 2026. So then that becomes a game changer for a lot of farming and ranching operations. Now I've got half of my exemption to play with than I had before. And so we're just going to have to wait and see until we get past the fall elections and who's controlling the White House, the Senate, and the House to get a better handle on where tax policy is headed.
And Roger, something we've mentioned quite a few times, but important to still mention when we're thinking about estate planning, the difference between fair and equal and on-farm and off-farm heirs.
Yeah, that's a real big deal for many farming operations that have multiple heirs, but not all of them want to farm, or say only one wants to farm. I say that's a big deal because parents often have, as an estate planning objective, the objective of treating their kids equally. I want to be fair to all my kids, so I'll just treat them equally. Well, the point that I try to make to people is that those two terms are not the same. Fair does not always mean equal, particularly when we're dealing with a family business, which is what a family farming operation is, if you're intending it to continue from generation to generation. The off-farm heirs want dollars out of that inheritance. They want money. The on-farm heirs want control. So what we want to do is when we still can equalize out the inheritances, but it's in terms of different assets, so to speak. We have a control aspect that's worth something, control of the operation, ownership of the assets of the operation. And then we have cash that can go to the off-farm heirs. So a lot of times what we deal with in that situation are ways and mechanisms we can put in place to accomplish that objective. And that might include life insurance, buy-sell agreements, making sure the wills and trusts are properly drafted, and so on, so that we can have an equitable type split of value rather than an equal split on an asset-by-asset basis.
Is it important to tell someone where all this paperwork and stuff is located?
Well, that's a great idea, because if whoever is left behind to take care of things doesn't know where things are at, it can create a lot of chaos. So I suggest that you keep things in perhaps a safe at home or some other well-documented place. Don't necessarily put all your key documents in a safety deposit box at a bank, because then whoever needs access to it is going to have prior authorization or go through a court process after death to get access to that. But make sure things are organized and put in a safe place, and keep people know where those important documents are at. That's very important.
And thinking about planning, also important to do some Social Security planning for farmers?
Yeah, I often get the question as to when a person should start withdrawing Social Security benefits. And my kind of snarky response back to that is, I said, well, I can tell you precisely when you can start in terms of maximizing your Social Security benefits if you'll just kindly tell me when you're going to die. And, of course, they can't do that, and so I can't give a precise answer. We can just kind of give guideposts to think about. And then if they want to get into the weeds, I can do that. And, in fact, in some of my technical tax seminars, I have a segment where it takes about an hour to go through it, and that is whether Social Security should be viewed as a tax or an investment. And there is where we get into bend points and your accumulated career earnings and all types of calculations. But I think a couple of basic points here for us to keep in mind is that your maximum Social Security benefits can be received if you don't withdraw benefits until you reach full retirement age. And that's presently, for many people that are working, that's currently between 66 and 67 years of age. And you get additional benefits for every year that you postpone withdrawing benefits until you reach age 70. That's the first point. Another point to keep in mind is that some Social Security benefits are reduced once you reach certain thresholds. So, for example, for this year, if you haven't reached full retirement age yet, so you're not 66 or 67, and you have earnings of more than $22,320, then your benefits are going to get reduced. Let's say you started withdrawing benefits at age 62 when you became eligible to do so. Well, if you have earned income over that $22,320 threshold this year, you're going to lose $1 of your Social Security benefits for every $2 you go above that limit. And during the year you reach full retirement age, your earnings limit jumps to $59,520 with a $1 reduction for every $3 you go over that limit. Then once you hit full retirement age, from there on out, the limit on earnings drops off. That's why you'll see older people working in retail stores, for example, and they're earning income. They're not subject to losing Social Security benefits because they're probably age 70 and above.
For people who are interested in looking into maybe when they should start drawing their benefits, do you have a resource you recommend, Roger?
The Social Security Administration has, I think, some really useful online calculators that are on their website, and that's ss.gov. And just take some time if you're interested in this, play around with that. Also, if somebody hasn't done so already, you can set up an account with the Social Security Administration so you can track what your benefits would be if you started withdrawing at a particular time. And that can be fairly useful. It's got all your earnings data in there and other information you can use to help you make an educated determination as to when you should start withdrawing benefits.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. I will link the resource that he mentioned as well as his blog article in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show talking with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, you've been receiving a few different questions and pictures about a few different insects across Kansas, and first, wanting to talk about armyworms.
Yes, armyworms have been an ongoing problem this year, last year, and the year before. Really, probably the last 3 years more than the previous 10. They've caused problems throughout the state. Why that is, I get that question all the time. I'm not sure. I'm sure it has something to do with the weather, but I don't know exactly what. But the fact is, we've got armyworms and we have fall armyworms out there. And the main question that I'm getting is, what's the difference between the two of them? Will the same insecticides take care of both? And how long will this last? Will this damage or the potential damage go on? So, first of all, the difference between a fall armyworm and an armyworm, as far as management goes or as far as the kind of damage they're going to do, it's probably not much. Fall armyworms, if you want to tell them apart, the fall armyworms generally a little browner in color. It can still be striped, but the key identifier is the 4 dark gray or black spots on the last abdominal segment, just towards the end. Even the small larvae, they're pretty distinctive, so you can tell them. But once the larvae get a little larger, they're readily apparent, I say. The true armyworm, which is the other culprit right now that's out and about quite a bit, they don't have those 4 spots. They're generally a little darker green and black, a little more striped, but you can't always go by that. But you can always go by those 4 dark spots, that last abdominal segment on the fall armyworm. The difference is fall armyworms don't overwinter in Kansas. So even though right now, if they're the same size larvae, their developmental schedule, if you will, is about the same. The eggs take, at these temperatures, take 3 to 5 days to hatch. The larvae then will emerge and start feeding immediately. The larvae will start feeding for probably 2 weeks, and then they'll pupate, and they'll pupate for maybe 6 or 7 days, and they become adults, and they start the cycle all over again. So it's, in both cases, armyworm or fall armyworm, it's about a month-long period of time from egg to egg. So you got about 2 weeks in there when they're actually going to be feeding. That's really important if you're trying to manage the damage. And they will feed in soybeans, they will feed in wheat, they will feed in just about, sorghum, corn, any of our crops. Right now, we're mostly worried about them in soybeans, but we'll worry about them in brome also. We'll worry about them in wheat later on. But The fall armyworm, if the population you're worried about is predominantly fall armyworms, once they pupated this time of year, I don't think they're going to oviposit or lay eggs again around here. I think once they pupate and the adults come out, I think they're going to fly south for the winter. They don't normally overwinter in Kansas, so there may be a few stragglers that lay eggs and continue feeding. But for the most part, I think if it's predominantly a fall armyworm population, those are going to fly south for the winter, so you're not going to have any more problems with fall armyworms as opposed to armyworms. Armyworms, for the most part, overwinter in Kansas. So if the worms that you're looking at don't have the 4 spots on the back, whether it's in brome or soybeans or whatever it is, if they don't have the 4 spots on the back, they're probably armyworms. Now, if you're in soybeans, it could be corn earworms because they'll feed on soybeans and they'll feed on pods also. But right now we're talking armyworms and fall armyworms, which are the ones I've been getting most calls on. The armyworm doesn't have the 4 spots. So once they've fed, and again, they have about the same time frame for their life stages as the fall armyworm, 4 or 5 days for the eggs, 2 weeks for the larval, which is a feeding period, maybe a week for pupae, and then they become adults. Armyworms, in this case, they're going to lay eggs in Kansas. So they're going to fly around, they're going to mate, and they're going to lay eggs. It's going to be another week, and then they're going to start feeding on whatever crop's available. A lot of times, this time of year, one of the key crops that's available is nice, lush, and green as wheat. Now, if we don't get any rain, that may not be the case. But for the most part, we worry about armyworms getting in wheat in the fall. And they will feed, again, they will go through this same life cycle until it gets too cold. And by too cold, I mean until it gets down into the mid-20s, at night for an hour or two. And that will stop the cycle. And then they will go into an overwintering mode. But the armyworm, I've seen them actively feeding on wheat in November. So if it's an armyworm population that, you're hosting right now in your crops and your brome or whatever it is, they will leave once the crop matures and senesces or turns brown or whatever you want to call it. They're going to leave and they're going to go to whatever's green in the area. And like I said, oftentimes this time of year, it's wheat. Now, right now it's early to plant wheat, and we hope you don't plant wheat early. That's another talk, that we need to plant wheat as late as agronomically possible for your area to help avoid some of these pests. But armyworms, they will go to just about any grass, so they can feed on lawns, any brome that's planted in the fall or anything. They will keep feeding. Fall armyworms, I'm hoping they're about through. As soon as I say that, there'll be another generation, that lays eggs, but usually, in the past, by mid-September to late September, the fall armyworms are gone, and we're just left with armyworms feeding in brome, wheat, whatever crops it is. So that's kind of the story on fall armyworms and armyworms right now.
Do people need to go out and treat the fall armyworms?
Yes, you need to get out and check out your treatment threshold. Everybody's treatment threshold's different. The pictures and the calls I've been getting from brome, if those worms are like, I hate to use size, but if they're an inch long, they're pretty mature, they're not going to feed much longer. They've been feeding for almost 2 weeks. They're about done, so they're going to pupate. So I probably, if they're relatively mature worms, I wouldn't waste money or spray trying to kill them. They're going to pupate. Just wait a week, 2 weeks, go back and start monitoring again to see if there's little ones out there. Remember, they're going to pupate. Once they've stopped feeding, they're going to pupate, and it's going to be 4 or 5 days. The moths are going to fly around. They're going to lay eggs. It's going to be another 4 or 5 days. So before you need to start looking, it's going to be 2 to 3 weeks down the road before the small ones hatch out, and you need to get to looking. There are several insecticides that work pretty well. We've tested them over the years. The key there is to make sure you use plenty of water, plenty of gallonage to get it through the foliage, if there's any left. And some of the brome fields I've seen, there's not much left, so that shouldn't be a problem. But to get it through the foliage, get the insecticide to where the worms are, because these are contact insecticides. So, yeah, great question. If they're small, probably justify treating. If they're large, I probably wouldn't. I'd say they're about done feeding and just go back in 2 or 3 weeks and check and start monitoring again to make sure there aren't any small ones out there.
And Jeff, what about, you mentioned volunteer wheat. What would you like to tell our growers about that?
Oh, man, volunteer wheat. Every year we got to get rid of the volunteer wheat for pests, all kinds of pests, pathogens, insects, mites, whatever it is, and plant as late as agronomically possible in your area. That's what I always recommend. Recently, there's a lot of growers I've noticed getting fields ready, preparing the fields for planting wheat. I understand that because as soon as it rains, they want to get that wheat in the ground prior to or just after. And it doesn't look to me like we got much rain on the forecast for, 2 weeks, 3 weeks down the road. So the thing is, if you're going to use an insecticide-treated wheat, if you do plant, that insecticide's only going to last 2 to 3 weeks, whether it's growing or not. It's only going to last 2 to 3 weeks, even if the seed's just in the ground. Now, I'm talking insecticides, not fungicides. Most of you have fungicide-treated seed. Very few treat with insecticides, but just in case, that's the time frame. 2 to 3 weeks is all they're going to be active, from when you plant it to whether they germinate or not. And if you wait as long as possible and you destroy all you volunteer, the main pests you're going to miss are, number one, aphids. Every year there are probably 25, 26, 27 different species of aphids that can vector barley yellow dwarf disease in the state. Every year they start coming in the fall. So if your wheat's there, they happen to be an infected aphid, they can transmit that to your wheat. If there's no wheat there, they'll go to your neighbors. So it's a good reason for area-wide volunteer wheat control. So the aphids and barley yellow dwarf, those are both mitigated by controlling volunteer wheat, especially the mites. The wheat curl mite that transmits or can vector several diseases. It can't fly, it can't jump, it can't hop. It just can barely crawl, so it goes from one plant to another. So if you're worried about weak streak mosaic virus, the only way that is transmitted from one plant to another is by the wheat curl mite. So if there's no volunteer, no problem with wheat curl mites out there. The other thing is the Hessian fly. Those are the three main groups of pests that we worry about with volunteer wheat. And the volunteer wheat is called the green bridge. It's the bridge between, when you harvest in June, July, until you plant. The only thing out there for these pests to live on is the volunteer wheat. So get rid of the volunteer. Again, Hessian flies can fly, so they can come quite a ways. So that's more of an area-wide type volunteer wheat destruction program. But those three pests really, really helps mitigate damage from those every year if you get rid of your volunteer wheat and plant as late as agronomically possible.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Anytime. My pleasure.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our show with another segment from the Beef Cattle Institute with Brad White, Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster.
So we're going to talk about trade. We've talked about it in the past. We'll just update some numbers, but spend a little more time talking about what does numbers mean. So we're going to start off with just a real simple question. Why do we trade with other countries?
One of the things that I go to meetings and they say things like our organ meats just don't have a high consumption in the United States. So we trade some of the tongue, the liver, the heart, some of the organ meats because those are actually quite desirable in other countries, and I'm happy to ship those away.
What's some other reasons?
I think it's bigger than just one industry, that sometimes we're trading something to get something back that they produce that we can't get, so we give them something that we have to get something that...
So we get access to food such as, I thought about that too, thinking bananas, pineapple, coffee, things that we don't produce here, so we get access to other foods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excess, just we have more than we can consume domestically.
Mm-hmm. Supply demand. Somebody took econ.
Yes. I was also thinking risk, right? So think if you're a Caribbean country and you get hit by a hurricane, if you don't import anything or export, then it's going to be a little hard once you get...
You have to have those trade lines set up long-term so that you're ready for when things change or happen.
So basically, you specialize in something and it allows you to maybe trade something. So think about efficiency when you maybe prices are a little bit lower because you're competing against other countries for products and stuff. So those are just some reasons why we trade. I think this data here that I'm going to quote you is for 2024 forecasts. It's quantity. It's coming from the American Farm Bureau. But who's the largest beef producer in the world?
As far as pounds?
Quantity, yeah.
Brazil, I think.
Brazil.
So this is the 2024 forecast. I think in 2023 it was. I mean, there's obviously going to be a high
He's
correlation.
saying we're wrong, so
Yeah.
you guys have a chance to re-guess now.
Yeah.
The U.S.
I was going to say, it's got to be
The
the
U.S. is the largest beef producer. So who's the largest consumer of beef in the world?
like a per
capita or
total for the country?
It's total. This is maybe total.
Okay, so I'm going to say us as well.
Yeah. It is U.S.
Us,
Yeah.
U.S.
Who's the largest exporter of beef in the world?
Us.
No.
I'm going to go Brazil.
Brazil.
Isn't it? I was gonna
Brazil,
go
Australia actually came in number 2. India's number 3, but
Yeah, India's kind of weird because they got the buffalo meat.
I was going to say that's fake meat, but not really.
Buffalo meat.
It's buffalo meat.
Yeah.
We're number 4, but who's the largest importer?
Oh, China?
China, and then we're number 2. So we're the largest producer, we're largest consumer,
And the
largest
second largest
importer, and
importer.
we're almost one of the largest exporters. So it seems odd.
Yeah.
But then coming back to, I think it was your comment, what do we import versus what do we export? I think that's where we can
Probably
really drill
import
down.
Not doing
lean
this-
so
not
that we
the
can mix
same
it with
thing.
our fat
So
for
in
making.
2023, we actually imported both dollar amounts and quantity about the same as we export. So it was about $10 billion and 1.3 million metric tons. If you go back,
Surely those were different products. I mean, it makes no sense
Yep.
just to ship some out.
but
and
if you
ship
go
some
back in
in.
the last few years prior to that, we were a net exporter. So now all of a sudden we're kind of even, and maybe in the next year it could be a net importer. Who knows? But what are some of the products that we import versus export? Let's just talk imports first. What do we import?
Beef products, you mean?
Lean.
Beef products, yeah.
Lean for hamburger.
Yeah.
To make, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, the data, it's not real clear because they call it very generic terms, but it's lean cuts is what we're importing because what's the most popular?
Hamburgers
the most
by far
popular.
the biggest
Right.
product. You know?
No. What are we exporting?
Well,
I agree
I
with
was going to
Bob.
say organ meats and things like that.
Yep.
But also some really high value
Exactly.
steaks and things like that.
So, Korea, Japan, some of those short plates,
Yeah, they like the
short ribs.
or the grain fed, highly marbled, high quality stuff.
Yep, and then the organ meats, right? The tongues, the livers, et cetera, things that we don't eat, and that's all relevant because in USMEF in June of this year, the value of an animal, roughly $460 of that value of the total animals because of exports on a per head basis, which I did some real quick math. That's about 16.3%.
That's up from previous years, isn't it? Yeah.
So about 16% of the value of a steer is due to exports.
Okay.
That's huge. So that export market, and I think as you described, highly tied to the import market and why we import export. Great explanation. Thanks, Dustin, for sharing with us.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.